Hi, I'm Max Rudin, President and Publisher of Library of America, and welcome to LOA Live. For those who don't know, Library of America is a nonprofit publisher and cultural institution dedicated to publishing authoritative new volumes of great American writers and to keeping the many-voiced American literary tradition a vital part of our culture for readers and writers to discover and rediscover. We're grateful to our partners this evening, the American Historical Association, the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, the Museum of the American Revolution, the National Council for History Education, and the New York Historical Society. A special welcome to Library of America fellows and members who support our nonprofit mission. 6 years ago, he was best known as the face on the $10 bill. Since then, the 7 syllables, Alexander Hamilton, have been sung and spoken everywhere from school playgrounds to the White House. His personal life probably as familiar now as that of any American statesman. Who was Hamilton and why is he important? Why has the musical struck such a chord and how accurate is it? What does it say about how artists find meaning in American history now? To answer these and other questions, we're incredibly lucky to have here tonight Hamilton expert Joanne Freeman, Professor of History and American Studies at Yale. She is author, most recently, of Field of Blood, Violence in Congress and the Road to Civil War, and editor of Library of America's definitive edition of Alexander Hamilton's writings, volume 129 in the Library of America series, which Lin-Manuel Miranda used as his source for Hamilton's language in the musical. She also edited a paperback selection for Library of America, The Essential Hamilton. Joanne will talk for about 25 minutes, then invite your questions. You can submit a question or comment at any time using the Q&A button on your menu bar. If you wish, let us know where you're viewing from. Now, please welcome Joanne Freeman.
Hello to everybody. Welcome. Me and I gather about 800 of my closest friends are here to talk about Hamilton. And it's my great pleasure to be here with you. I feel the need to say at the outset, as Max suggested, Hamilton to say that he's having a moment is the understatement of the year. I've been studying Hamilton for a very long time, and the quirkiest, most surreal aspect of this to me is that in all the time that I studied him, really most Americans didn't know who he was. And now everyone knows who he is, and I spend a lot of my time trying to tell people, well, he's great, he's important, but maybe not quite as great and important as you think. So it's surreal and odd for a historian, but I am here. Hamilton is fascinating. The play is fascinating and wonderful. And of course, now that it's on film, more and more people have seen it, which is part of why we're here this evening. So what I want to do with you tonight is 2 things. I want to look at history and Hamilton in 2 ways. So first, I want to talk a little bit about facts. Some of what's right in the play, some of what's wrong in the play, and I know a lot of you have asked questions that are going to address that as well. I'll talk a little bit about that, and then perhaps during the Q&A we can talk about some of that as well. And then I want to talk a little bit about, number one, a little about Hamilton as a person, and then I'll end by talking about a few things broader than Hamilton and that are broader than facts that the play gets right or that the play misses, all of which I think are important for a bunch of reasons. And then, as Max said, we will open things up and you can ask your questions. So let's plunge in. I want to talk a little bit about some of what's not so accurate in the play. But before I do, I want to offer you an accuracy disclaimer. And by that, I mean, and this is going to be the world's most obvious thing for me to say, but I feel the need to say it. Hamilton is musical theater. It is not a work of history. That is a very obvious thing to say, right? It's a work of art. I wouldn't use the play in isolation to teach history. I don't think there's any work of art, any piece of musical theater, any play that I would use for that purpose. So I do think, and I say that as my accuracy disclaimer, because in talking about all of this historical accuracy this evening, I don't want that point to be lost, which is what's there and what isn't there and what should be there and what should not be there is important because it helps us understand and think about history and thus about ourselves. But I don't want to suggest that everything that I'm talking about tonight, at least some of it, should have been there, or else this would have been a 10-hour play in some ways. So my accuracy disclaimer. But now let's plunge in a little bit and talk a little bit about factual accuracy, factual historical accuracy. And as was mentioned in the introduction, the most obvious way in which you're getting actual factual history is in Hamilton's words. When I went to see the play for the first time, and I knew that the Library of America Hamilton volume, that Lin-Manuel Miranda had used it as a source. Even so, when I went to see the play for the first time and hearing, you know, so I'm the person who knows all of the letters. So I could listen to the play and I could think, oh, that's that letter from 1792. Oh, that's the letter from 1804. There's a lot of Hamilton's own language in the play. And I think part of the craft of the show and the skill of the writing is that as an audience member, or as someone listening to the music, you don't sit there and think to yourself, oh, well, that's a quirky 18th century statement. Like, why are we listening to that? You don't necessarily hear the real language being dropped in, and yet it's there. And that, you know, for me, when I knew that this crazy playwright was going to write about a musical about Hamilton, what I wanted was Hamilton's own words in the play. And so it thrills me that that happened. And I just want to offer you one or two examples of that. And the first one actually isn't Hamilton. I just have to mention it because I still can't believe this happens in the play. And that is that they sing George Washington's farewell address. They sing George Washington's farewell address. That was probably one of the many moments when I was watching the play that my jaw dropped because I just couldn't quite believe that that was happening. So that is the farewell address. Hamilton did indeed draft a version of it that Washington then edited, but the fact that that's there and that they show that in the stagecraft, that first you hear Hamilton's voice and then you hear Washington's voice, I adore that. But let's talk a little bit about words. I want to talk about three things in particular. One of them is a little phrase that gets uttered towards the beginning of the show, but it's a meaningful phrase, so I want to mention it. Towards the beginning of the show, and I think it's in the scene when Hamilton and his squad are in that tavern, Hamilton says, I wish there was a war. I'm not going to know the lyrics as well as all of you in the audience, but I wish there was a war, blah, 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 for. Whatever the lyric is. At any rate, I wish there was a war comes directly out of actually the first letter that we know of Hamilton's that exists, written when he was maybe 14-ish years old. He writes to a friend of his named Edward Stevens. Stevens was already off of St. Croix and in Edinburgh getting an education to go into medicine. Hamilton was still back on St. Croix, seemingly with no way out. And it's this letter in which he says to his friend, Ned, as he calls him, I wish I could get off of this island. Basically, I know I'm going to find a way to do it. He said, I hope you come back soon, but when you do come back, I might not be here because I'm bound to get off of this island. But at the end of the letter, he says, you know, such schemes are successful, meaning getting himself off the island, when the projector is constant. I shall conclude saying, I wish there was a war. And what he means by that is, and you get a sense of that in the play, how could he begin what he wanted to be this great life of ambition, and I suppose he wanted glory? Well, one way would be for there to be a war that he could enlist in, and his mind ideally be an officer, and then earn glory and acclaim and status and a title through a war. So he means that in a really practical way, which is some of what gets across in the play, but it's kind of wonderful that it's there. Another phrase that is from Hamilton's pen, and which is a beautiful one, Later in the play, Hamilton calls Eliza best of wives and best of women, and that's Hamilton. I remember at some point when Lin-Manuel Miranda was working on the play, I think it was brand new on Broadway, and we were talking about some of the actual words of Hamilton that appear in the show, and we talked about best of wives and best of women, and he said something like, how could I not put that in the show? Right? It's a beautiful phrase, but here's the kind of kicker about that phrase. It comes from a letter written July 4th, 1804, that Hamilton wrote to Eliza not long before he went to fight his final duel. He wrote her this letter. He says, this letter, my very dear Eliza, will not be delivered to you unless I shall first have terminated my earthly career. So if he dies, this letter will be delivered to her, and it concludes, adieu, best of wives and best of women. Embrace all my darling children, for me, ever yours. So at times when I've talked about the play with people and talked about the history of it, they've said, how is the history even sadder than the play? And in some ways, it is. And that's a great example. The last sort of text I want to mention here before moving on to something else is one that a lot of people ask about. And that has to do with a comma, right? There's a song in the play in which Angelica says that Hamilton wrote her a letter and there was a misplaced comma. So that rather than saying, my dearest Angelica, comma, supposedly the letter says, my dearest, comma, Angelica. And in the play, it makes much of the fact that, you know, she kind of wants it to be meaningful, that misplaced comma, that somehow he's looking to her with love in his eyes. Well, here's the interesting fact. That's actually the reverse of what happened. In fact, Angelica in real life misplaced the comma, and Hamilton was the one who wrote to her with a sort of, does that mean anything? He writes a letter that sort of vaguely, I noticed this comma. Should I be thinking about this? And she says, basically, no, she shoots that down right away. That's one point that's worth noting, is that Angelica and Hamilton had a very flirtatious relationship, but there's no evidence that it went beyond that. And she was already married at the time when Hamilton got married. So that's their relationship in the play and her pining for him is very much a little pizzazz that's added to the play. And she's a remarkable character in the play. Okay, so I want to talk about one or two events that are in the play and that are true. The fact of the matter is, there are a lot of events in the play that really happened. They're sometimes twisted or only shown in part or condensed or put out of time. I mean, there are all kinds of ways in which, as a historian, you can watch the play and write a list like, oh, that didn't happen then, and that happened first, and this didn't happen in that year, and he didn't do this for that reason. There are a lot of cases of that. I don't necessarily want to flood you with that right now. I did, when the film aired, I did live tweet along with everybody else. So anyone who wants an ongoing running commentary on the film, somewhere out there on my Twitter feed, it lurks. But what I wanted to mention was, in particular, one event that's pretty much realistic, and that is the dinner deal that takes place in the song, The Room Where It Happens. And so what really happened, you know, for those of you who don't necessarily know that scene in the play, Hamilton and Jefferson and Madison go off in a room by themselves to negotiate. Hamilton wants his financial plan passed, the assumption of state debts passed, and in exchange for that, the Southerners want the capital moved further south, which is precisely what happened in that dinner deal, which sometimes historians call the dinner deal of 1790. It really happened. It happened with those three people. Jefferson arranged it, so he did arrange the venue and the seating. And what's wonderful about that song is, I'm not going to get the words precisely right, but it's repeated over and over again. It's like Thomas says, Thomas said, Thomas wrote, whatever that line is. What's wonderful about that is we know those events because Jefferson wrote an account of them. He says, I met Hamilton, he looked distraught, he looked as though his plan wouldn't get passed, I arranged a dinner, I asked Madison to be there. So not only is that song talking about an event that really happened, it's referencing the document that Jefferson wrote in which he describes it. Now I know that, you know, no one in the audience is probably sitting there thinking about that except a handful of historians, but there's so much reference in the play to real documents and to the loss of documents, right? We see Eliza burn her letters in the middle of the play. And the fact is, a lot of her letters didn't survive, not necessarily because she was angry about Hamilton having an adulterous affair, but a lot of wives of founder folk, sort of prominent public people, burned their letters because they wanted to keep some aspect of their private lives private. So, you know, the play makes a lot of reference to what survives of history, to obviously to the story that survives and what story gets told. And that's a wonderful, as a historian, my heart is happy for that, but I think that offers one of several other important lessons that the play offers about what is history and how do we know history, and what does get discussed and what doesn't, which I'm going to come back to momentarily. I'm only going to mention a few basic things, events that, you know, aren't necessarily in the play. One of them is the wedding, Hamilton's big wedding. I think at some point early on, I asked Lin-Manuel Miranda about that, about why he has a big wedding, because Hamilton had a very small wedding. He went to the Skylar's house. He had a friend with him. It was very, very small. And he said something like, you know, well, you got to give the guy a big wedding, which comes from the heart. But obviously also dramatically speaking, it's great to have a big party or an event because you get to have all of your characters in the same place at the same time. So there wasn't a big wedding. I'm happy that there was, because some of the songs in that wedding were wonderful. But at any rate, Hamilton just had a small private affair. The other thing that's worth noting before I talk a little bit more about Hamilton himself is in real life, he and Burr were not quite so tied to each other as the play suggests. And it's entirely understandable as to why that's the case in the play. It's kind of the spine of the play, that these two men have such constant contact, meet each other over and over again, which sometimes they did, but not quite as much as the play suggests. So it sets up the drama between these two men, which in real life, although they weren't sort of going side by side through their careers and lives, the fact of the matter is they very much were moving in the same circles, had a lot of the same friends, sometimes argued law cases together. They were together a lot. Their politics conflicted over time a lot. So it isn't too much to say that their enmity for both of them was something that was sort of front and center for them. Hamilton in 1792 writes a letter in which he says, and this is pretty much a direct quote, I consider it my religious duty to oppose his career, to oppose Burr's career. That's a statement. And he makes that statement in part because he thinks Burr is someone who's just as ambitious as he, Hamilton, is, but that Burr isn't reined in by any greater cause, and that makes him a dangerous man. And Hamilton, unfortunately for Hamilton, stays true to that, and the final duel is the outcome of many years of opposition between these two men. Now that said, I want to talk really briefly just about how much of Hamilton is in the play, and then I'm going to make a few points about some of the things that are important, big picture in the play, and then we can open things up for questions. But the fact of the matter is, Hamilton, some of Hamilton is really in the play. He was a difficult man, right? He was impulsive, he was touchy, he was combative, he was something of a manic writer, right? Really, his writing, his words did make his career, bring him fame, and then destroy him. That's all true. So some aspects of his personality are in the play. What isn't really in the play, and in a sense, I wouldn't expect it to be, But it's important when you want to understand Hamilton, and that is his politics. Because Hamilton, although he really believed in the experiment in government that was going on and said, and I think believed he would do his best to preserve it, he was pushing it in the direction that he thought was best, and not a lot of people agreed with him. You know, he wanted a strong centralized government, and he wanted a very powerful president, and he was pushing in a direction that made people nervous. He wasn't really fond of a democratic politics, right? Like the politics in the street, people up in arms in the street. He didn't trust that. He didn't trust the public that way. He wasn't comfortable with it. Jefferson was more comfortable with that kind of uproar among white men in the street. Hamilton was not that fond of democracy. And also, he had a really kind of brass tacks view of human nature. He believed basically that people were essentially self-interested, and a good government should just channel the self-interest in useful ways, send it off in good paths. And because of that, to keep the government going, you can't just count on everybody to buy into it out of the goodness of their heart. You have to get the rich and the well-born to attach themselves to it, to literally invest in it. So he does put a lot of effort into wooing and attracting the elite, the rich, the well-born. There are aspects of his politics that make sense for him, but that aren't necessarily things that we would be comfortable with today, or at least some of us, and certainly would be hard to get in musical theater in any kind of a play that other than historians might want to go hear. I want to mention three basic things here, and one of them is about Hamilton. It'll segue me into the final points here. And one of them is about Hamilton and slavery. Hamilton was not an abolitionist. He was anti-slavery. He belonged to the New York Manumission Society. He was its president for a time. He was on the right side of that issue, but it wasn't a lifelong quest for him. It wasn't one of the main concerns of his life. And the fact is true that his in-laws, the Skylars, did own enslaved people. And there's evidence that he may have occasionally dealt in the buying and selling of people as well. So he's not entirely clean on that front. As I said, he's on the right side, but it's a lot more complicated. And as a historian who talks about this, this is always something that I think is important to talk about, because nothing surrounding race in this period, or little surrounding race in this period, is that cut and dried, is that good and bad. Some of it's bad, but you can't just say he was good when it came to this and draw a line. And this is a great example of that. Now that leads to my last sort of couple points here, and then I really want to open it up because I want to answer your questions. And the first has to do with race and the play. Now, obviously, the diverse casting of the play is important to its message, and also obscures the fact that essentially it's telling a story about a popular revolution focusing on a handful of elite white men, which it does, right? It's the people in the play are the people who, if we know history, they're pretty much the people we know. And the fact is, as I just mentioned, the revolution was a popular revolution, and there were elite men, like the men in this play, who played an important role in it, but we don't really see anyone other than them. Again, I want to go back to my accuracy disclaimer at the outset, musical theater, but it is true. The play gives an image that is very much in line with a very old image of American history, that, you know, 8 white guys did everything, and it's more complicated than that, and there are more people and more voices to be heard. Along the same lines, slavery is barely in the play, and the fact of the matter is, of course, American society was grounded on it, the economy was grounded on it, the nation was built on it. So you can't tell the story of early America without slavery. And it makes perfect sense that people would watch that play and say, what is it offering? It's this weird, cleaned off, sort of skimmed version of American history. And I think there's validity in that. But I suppose my way of responding to that is, again, it's a play, and slavery should be there. This play is the greatest teaching tool that you can imagine, because young people are so smitten with it. And what that means is you can teach against the play. The absence of slavery in that play is a thing that we should be teaching about, right? What's not in the play? What's missing? What picture is it drawing? And what picture should it be drawing? That's an invaluable way in to talking about this play with students. And I can swear, as someone who's been teaching early American history for a long time, this is not a period that young people tend to be really interested in. So it's helpful, as much as it's inaccurate and as much as it's telling only part of a story. The absence of part of that story is really important and opens a conversation in a way that is more important now than it ever has been. We're having a conversation right now about whose voices matter, how we get to hear those voices. Anything that contributes to really delving into that conversation and wrestling with it, not an easy conversation, is a good thing. And to me, this play pushes in that direction. Two final points that I want to talk about that represent two things that the play does really well, that I think really helps people understand the founding in a different way, and in some ways the present in a different way. The two things that the play does really well as fiction and as history. Number one, it gets across the fact that the people in the play, that the founder is all capital letters, were real people. They're not blocks of marble. They weren't perfect. They didn't always know what they were doing. They made mistakes. Americans think about the founding in all capital letters as a bunch of statues, really think about them as a bunch of statues, blocks of marble, and nothing to be questioned about them, which is wrong, right? It's not how our country was founded. It's not who we ever were. So the play, by introducing people to the idea that the founders are very flawed and very human and not who you thought they were, opens a door that I think for a lot of people has been shut for a very long time. And I think that's important. The final point I want to make, and this is the one that I think in some ways has the most pressing importance now, today, and it also is something the play does really well. It highlights the fact of contingency, right? It highlights the fact that these people didn't know what would happen, that the founding generation didn't know if anything would work, didn't know if they would win the revolution, didn't know that there would be a constitution, didn't know if that constitution would work, didn't know any of courses. There are no of courses, or very few of them, in the founding period. We take that for granted. And contingency, when you're studying history, contingency should always be front and center, because people live through their lives in the moment. They can't look back and understand what's coming. We do that, right? We do that with the looking back in time from the present. They can't. To understand history, you have to try and understand how people are seeing things in the unknowingness of the future, looking ahead. And I think right now we're living in a highly contingent time. There's a lot happening, and some of it is unprecedented, and no one really knows what's going to happen. And that matters. It matters. We should understand that. We should be aware of that. We shouldn't take things for granted. And we should think about what we do, how we do it, when we do it. We should think about our actions and our words, because they mean something in a contingent moment. We don't know what's coming next. And that simple fact, as Hamilton gets across so well, means that our actions and our words matter. And I just think in this historic moment, there almost can't be a more important lesson. So that I will end there, magically presto at 6:30, and Max will come back, and I will get to answer some of your questions. Well, Max has not come back yet, so now I'm just talking to you. While we're waiting for him, I am going to show and tell, which I was wondering if I would get a chance to show you, and didn't, and so now I get to. Hang on a sec here, folks. Hi there, Max. Before you start asking questions, I do want to show this. This is an original Reynolds pamphlet. So came out, you know, when Hamilton's adulterous affair was revealed. This is an original copy of it. Um, as a historian, not only do I like the real words, but I like the real artifacts too. So I couldn't resist having that here to show you.
Thank you, Joanne. That was really great. And you've opened up a lot of areas for us to dig into. Before we, I think before we jump into the content, I think a couple people had kind of a more personal question. Kelsey Earl of Albion, Michigan asks, what sparked your interest in Hamilton kind of in the first place? And Christy B on our Q&A says the same thing. How did you discover Hamilton and what made you so passionate about this area of history?
Well, it's a good question. The short answer is a combination of the bicentennial and reading a lot. So I was the right age when the bicentennial, with the lead up to the bicentennial, I was like a preteen, and that's the perfect age to be obsessed with something. And history was everywhere, and the founding was everywhere, and I became interested in it, and I started reading biographies. And I think I started at A, sort of worked my way, and got up to Hamilton and stopped because he was so different. He had a weird beginning. He had a strange end for a 13, 14-year-old. I wanted to understand him, and it seemed interesting to me because there were not a lot of books about him. So it sort of felt like it was mine. And so I became interested in figuring him out. And when I found his published papers, that was it. I then, you know, there are 27 volumes. I would just read through the 27 volumes and finish and then start again and read through the 27 volumes. That was fascinating to me because that was the actual stuff of history. No one was telling me what to think. No one was interpreting it for me. So those things together, I think, are what sort of set me off on the Hamilton trail.
Great. Well, I think, you know, there were a lot of questions about Hamilton and race and the musical and racial questions, and they're interesting. There are many different angles on this. I think some of them you've answered or addressed already, like William Irwin from Furlong, Pennsylvania says, what was Hamilton's public and private position on slavery and what did he actually do about it? That's one direction. Scott Ritter of Winsted, Connecticut says, do you feel any cognitive dissonance in slaveholders being portrayed in a noble manner by people of color? Different kind of question. Jennifer Bolton asks, can you provide some insight on the enslaved people who were in the room where it happened? Right. She's writing from Phoenixville, Pennsylvania. Brian Reagan from St. Louis asks, did Hamilton know any free persons of African descent?
Okay.
And then, I'm sorry to ask you so many, but they're all cluster questions. You can take them in any order. And then finally, Emily Lau from Islesboro, Maine asks, how has Hamilton musical remade America's ideology about race? I think the implication being that you know, despite the multiracial casting, that it hasn't. I think is the question. So, however you want to tackle those questions, I think people are really interested in this subject.
Okay, maybe I'll start with the last one in a way and kind of work my way back. Of how has the play altered anything in how we think about or talk about race? You know, when I sat down to watch the film, I thought about comments on the play when it came out as a play. And people were talking about race and they were talking about the absence of slavery in the play. And it was part of the discussion. There were articles published. The discussion now is more pointed on that topic and more sustained on that topic and has a different kind of energy. And that makes sense to me because obviously we're in a moment where we're really wrestling with who we are as a nation and who is the our in our story and what do we remember and why. So, you know, in a way, has the play altered debate? I don't know if I'd say that it has, but it's part of a debate. It's opened a debate or it's feeding into a debate that we do have to have. So if that means that people are going to watch the play and have cognitive dissonance, that they're watching people of color who are acting as enslaved people, good. You know, good, because we can talk about that. There are so many categories of things here that Americans, I think, avoid talking about. And we have to talk about them. And if the play is an avenue for compelling people to do that, even if it's because they're upset about the play, I think I think that's a plus. I'm trying to remember what some of those other questions were.
Did Hamilton know any free persons of African descent? And what do we know about people who were in the room where it happened?
Okay, that was the question I know I wanted to come back to for sure. He probably did know free people of color because partly his work for the Manumission Society, he would have been in and about a variety of different kinds of people, but I can't name a name for you. I mean, it's one of the ways in which you know that abolitionism or anti-slavery was not a primary cause for him. When you read through all of his letters, there's not a lot in there about slavery. He mentions it during the Revolution. He does support Lawrence's plan to create a battalion of African-American soldiers, but there's not a lot else that you can see. But there likely was an enslaved person in the room where it happened. It was in Jefferson's home. It would be hard to imagine that there wouldn't be. I don't know about that person, but whenever I talk about the play or that scene, I always talk about that because it's a sort of slap in the face about someone who's missing in a scene that is very much about close interaction of all of these people.
There are interesting questions about, the interpretation of characters who are in the play, and then there's some interesting questions about what's not in the play. Just to take the first, Stan Schroeder of Flemington, New Jersey wonders if you feel the portrayal of Aaron Burr is fair. Kim Wiley asks from Columbus, Ohio, do you think the musical accurately reflects Eliza's presence and contributions? Jan Boudart says that as a leftist, Jan is delighted at the portrayal of Jefferson. And can you say something more about the non-angelic side of Jefferson's career? And finally, Ellen Coate of Pearland, Texas, asks about the Skylar family and the role they played. So, take any of the ones you want. Burr, Jefferson, Eliza's contributions, or the Skylars, more broadly.
Okay, I'll start with Burr, since, he, along with Hamilton, are sort of at the center of the play. Burr gets, I think, a little bit of a bum deal in the historical record, and now is the point where Hamiltonian lightning will strike me for saying this, but in some ways, he had admirable aspects to him. He was, for example, ahead of his time in his thinking about women. He read Mary Wollstonecraft. He thought about women's rights. He's not, as the play kind of suggests, just the evil guy, the villain in the history book, right? He has more complexity. I think the play does a good job of showing that there's some complexity there, and particularly, I guess, at the end, in showing him being conflicted and having some self-awareness about the duel. He's a person, even more so than Hamilton, that hasn't been explored in depth. And because he did so many things in his life that are questionable, was he trying to create his own empire in the West? We don't know, but he might have been, and he got tried for that. He shot Hamilton, which is problematic. There are any number of things he did in the course of his life that, he was an opportunist, and that made him a good politician, but that made him suspect to some people. But I think the play gave him complexity and saved him from being just a simple villain. I think it was more complicated than that. Eliza. So Eliza, so it's interesting. A lot of her letters didn't survive. So when you read Hamilton's papers, his letters to her survive, not really many of hers back. However, she lived another 50 years, as the play puts it. She lived a very long time. And she was that final scene at least does some tribute to her. She was active in charity. She did help found this orphanage, or apparently orphanages and orphans was the Hamilton family charity, generally speaking, because of Hamilton's origins. She's dedicated a lot of time with two of her sons to trying to preserve the record of what Hamilton did, trying to collect his papers, trying to prove that he wrote a draft of the farewell address, finding a biographer who would write about him. So she really did dedicate a lot of her older years into preserving the legacy of her husband.
And Jefferson?
Jefferson. So Jefferson, boy, if Burr and Hamilton are conflicting characters, Jefferson is way up there. On the one hand, in some ways, he's the poet of the revolution. He writes these phrases that represent these sort of ideals we want to be true. On the other hand, he's a slaveholder and has mixed views, to put it gently, about race. He feels positive about democracy. He's more comfortable with that than Hamilton is, but there's the problem of slavery. So there are aspects of him, I teach a course at Yale called The Age of Hamilton and Jefferson, and we teach it entirely with the Jefferson volume and the Hamilton volume of the Library of America editions, which is I'm not even lying, I'm telling the truth, Max. But one of the things that happens in the course of that is that people wrestle with these two people, and Jefferson they wrestle with particularly because they come into the course, and now that's not the case anymore, but it used to be they would come into the course just thinking about him as the sort of noble sage of democracy, and then they read through his letters and they reveal that that's not entirely true. Now I think people enter with a more complex side. In the end, what that means is that what they're struggling with is how do you reconcile, or you can't, I suppose, how do you think about American ideals and the many ways in which we failed them at the same time? And I think you have to do both of those things. I think you can't talk about American history, talk about American ideals without talking about the many ways in which we didn't live up to them. It doesn't mean that we can't move in a better direction in the future, but some of what we're discussing now is this very issue. And Jefferson in some ways encapsulates that conflict about what we do and what we don't look at and count and consider and really wrestle with.
Following that up, Jennifer Carter from Springdale, Arkansas asks you, if there was one other historical figure you could add to the musical,
Ooh.
Who would you add and why?
Wow.
And then sort of a related question, Anthony Amor from Boston says, John Adams was largely left out. I wasn't trying to give you the answer to the first question. John Adams was largely left out of the musical. Why? What was their relationship? So and then I'll follow up after you answer
Okay.
that.
Well, so a couple things. One thing I might do is give Madison a little bit more of a role. He kind of he's kind of the also guy to Jefferson. Adams is a character. And so he would be an amusing person to add to the play, but also it would be interesting to put him in there because he and Hamilton are of the same political alliance, but they really don't get along. And ultimately it's their division that helps destroy their party and give the election to Jefferson. So he would be interesting to put in there. But the first person that came to mind, and this is a true geeky historian answer because no one's going to know who this guy is, or some of you will, but my first response was Rufus King of New York. And the reason I say that is Rufus King was the guy that Hamilton went to and said, I want to do this, what do you think? And King was the guy who said, are you kidding me? Like, are you really? So Hamilton considered King like this man he went to for advice. Hamilton didn't ask advice very often and almost never took it. But King is the guy who he took his ideas to and who responded. And that actually might be really interesting to put into the shows, to have someone who responds to whatever Hamilton's doing by saying, what? Like, what? Really? You want to do that?
Good. Related question asked actually by two people, Barbara Dixon from Silver Springs, Maryland, and John Cardoza from Ventura, California. Is there an incident, because you answered the question about the character, is there an incident from Hamilton's life that you would add to the musical, or that you think would add something to the musical that wasn't depicted?
You guys are asking hard questions. Well, so here's the thing. There isn't a lot of Hamilton's politics in the play. So generally speaking, if it were a different play, I would want more of his politics. An aspect, so in the play, we do get a sense of him like really being passionate about wanting the Constitution to succeed and caring about the economy. And we get a sense of some of the things he cared about. One of the things that's striking about him, and that the play doesn't deal with and would have made it very complicated, is he was, not, as I mentioned before, not comfortable with popular uproar, democracy in the streets. He had an unfortunate tendency to want to call in troops to march on the public when there were moments of unrest. You know, the image everyone has of Hamilton right now is like the bootstraps guy who's you know, only heroic, and he is admirable in so many ways, but as with everything else I've been talking about here, he's complicated. You know, he's someone who, in a sense, is an immigrant, and then in the late 1790s, is not happy about immigrants voting because they're going to vote for Jefferson. So, you know, everything is more complicated. That's what, you know, every historian says. You ask them something and they'll say, it's complicated. But, you know, in a different play with a different purpose, some of this complexity and some of the real problems that looking back, many of us might have problems with, would be interesting to mix up in a play and see how it would wrestle with them.
The inevitable subject of the duel. There are many questions about this. Rylan Neem of Bellingham, Washington says, since duels were about defending your honor, why was Burr's honor so tarnished by shooting Hamilton? And some other questions. Kathleen Hall Scanlon asks, why did a cordial relationship between Hamilton and Burr devolve into a duel? Jeffrey Tinkleman from Los Angeles asks, did Alexander Hamilton throw away his shot and really aim away from Burr during the duel? Heather Donahue from Pawcatuck, Connecticut. What was it about his personality or upbringing that led him to risk his life dueling? She doesn't know who she's asking this question of. And Nathan Perkins of Fullerton, California says, was Burr acting in self-defense, or has time made a martyr out of Hamilton? So a series of questions. How did Hamilton and Burr end up dueling? What was it about Hamilton that led to the duel? And then what about the details that are portrayed? Did he really, you know, not try to shoot at Burr? Why was Burr's honor tarnished, etc.? So they don't know that you're the world's expert on dueling.
Right. So I'll talk a little bit about dueling, and then I'll talk about this duel. One of the really important things to know about dueling, and particularly between politicians in this period, and this is going to sound really counterintuitive, but the point of a duel was not to kill someone. The point of a duel is to prove that you were willing to die for your honor. So the point of it was just to show up and be there and show that you were so protective of your honor as a gentleman that you would die for it. Most of the duels that happen, there aren't deaths. There are a lot of leg wounds if somebody gets shot. I remember finding a newspaper and it referred to that fashionable place to get shot, the shin. So there were a lot of duels in which, you know, there were leg wounds or no wounds at all. So the first question about why is Burr's image tarnished, part of the answer to that is he actually killed his opponent. There aren't, I think in New York, there's one other duel in roughly this time period where someone gets killed, and just like Burr, that person has to leave town, his friends leave town, and in Burr's case, he's already a controversial politician. So all of his enemies on all sides gather around to basically destroy him and depict him as this evil murderer who cheated somehow and really try to destroy him. So that's politics, in essence, kind of destroys him. Related to that, and also one of the questions relates to this, Hamilton left a last letter for Eliza. He also wrote a final statement to be released only in case of his death, in which, handily for us, he describes why he's fighting the duel and why he feels like he can't turn away. And he says a bunch of things, you know, I've said things about Burr over the years. I can't take them back because I believe them. Burr was rude to me during the negotiations, and so I can't back out in any way. And then at the end, he says something like, this is not going to be quite a direct quote, but close. Those of you who consider with me that I should simply have not taken part in a duel, he says, in the future crises in our nation that seem likely to happen, I felt the need to protect my reputation as a man of honor so that I could step forward. So in other words, he's predicting some huge crisis. He was never absolutely confident that the government would survive. So part of what he says he's doing is, I need to protect my reputation so that I will be a man of honor who can step in and lead when leadership is needed. So that's how he explains it. You know, we don't know for sure what he did with his shot. He told Rufus King, that he was going to throw away a shot. I'm telling you, Rufus King. And Rufus King said, "Are you crazy?" He's just, why would you do that? If you're going, then you should at least aim in his direction. And Hamilton says, "No, I have religious scruples. The first time we exchange fire, I'm not going to shoot at him. If Burr demands a second fire, then I'm not sure." So, you know, Hamilton's second says that he aimed up. Burr's second says, you know, no, he didn't. But Burr admits in this wonderful phrase afterwards, he describes what he calls, quote, "the flurry of mind that you feel when you're on a dueling ground facing your opponent." So he's not, I think, no one I think is ever entirely sure what happened, but I think Hamilton, he told Rufus King he was basically that first shot going to throw away that shot. And thus, in a sense, he does. Oh, and one last thing I wanted to mention, which is somehow related to all these questions. When Burr and Hamilton are negotiating the duel, somewhere in the midst of that, Burr says, "Twice before we almost dueled." And Hamilton says, "No, no, once before." But all by itself, that's interesting. And I think one of those times is the election of 1800. I think about the play. Hamilton says, "Don't vote for Burr, vote for Jefferson." And I think that becomes an almost duel that doesn't happen. I don't know where the second one would be, and Hamilton denies it, but all by itself, that's really fascinating.
That's fascinating. The play makes a lot of Hamilton the immigrant and the theme of immigration, and there are many viewers tonight are interested in that. Barbara Dixon of Silver Spring, Maryland says, "Was Hamilton considered an immigrant at the time?" And John McKean asks, what would Hamilton's reactions be to the history of the United States' changing views toward immigrants and immigration, do you think?
So so the word immigrant has a lot of baggage, modern baggage attached to it. At the time, if you were bouncing around between parts of, say, the British Empire, you wouldn't have been an immigrant moving from one part of the empire to another in the way that we understand that now, which is, I come from a foreign land, you know, I'm coming to a new country. You would be moving to a different part of the empire. So on the one hand, he was seen as someone who in some ways was an outsider, not the only one of that status, but, you know, a lot of people like Jefferson and Adams and these other people, their families went way back, had lived in the same spot. People knew who they were, knew who their family was. They had been holding offices of local offices. They were a known commodity. Hamilton wasn't in that sense. But I think what people were more likely to talk about with him was not, you know, oh, he comes from somewhere else, but the fact that he was illegitimate. That comes up when people want to smack at him. There's one letter in which he addresses that. But I don't think in his identity, I think the fact that he was an outsider, maybe not quite immigrant, mattered to some people. There's a phrase that people use at the time to represent someone who appears out of nowhere, has no roots, and is just suddenly there and important in some way. They would have called that person a mushroom gentleman. Something that sprouts up out of nowhere and has no roots. Hamilton would have been in the mushroom gentleman category, and that would have alarmed people. But, you know, as I suggested a little while back, he is in some way, not in the modern sense, an immigrant, but in the late 1790s when his party is not doing very well, he's not really thrilled that people who are immigrating here are going to be allowed to vote because they're going to vote for Jefferson. So he's conflicted in many ways, and the person who's in the play doesn't lead you to think about all of these other ways in which things change and politics changes and people change and, you know, all of the things that we see every day. He's a complicated, I mean, it's part of why I'm so interested in him. He's a complicated character. He's full of conflicts. He's got this strong personality and strong politics and no filter. You know, he's for a lot of reasons, he's a really interesting person to study. Let's
close with some questions about legacy. Who tells your story? Scott Table of Mequon, Wisconsin asks, why wasn't Hamilton considered electable as president? And that rhymes with several questions about was it really the Reynolds pamphlet? Was it really that incident that kept him from being a possible candidate for president? So there's that question. Then the related questions, why is who asks this? Forrest Shaw of Fayetteville, North Carolina asks, why is Hamilton honored with so few memorials and institution namings? Kind of a related question. And then Joseph Bailey, what one thing from Hamilton's vision for the US still stands? So electability as president, has he been neglected in terms of subsequent honors? And what from his vision for the country is part of the country we live in?
Okay, so electability first. The fact of the matter is he was electable as president. Basically, if you were a citizen at the time of the ratification of the Constitution, you were eligible to run for president. So he was eligible, but he knew very well, and the Reynolds pamphlet didn't have anything to do with it. He knew very well he was not popular, he was not widely liked, and that was just, that was not in the cards for him, and he doesn't ever really express an interest in that. There's a moment when he's being considered to be sent to England to negotiate a treaty, and he basically says to Washington, that's going to be a mistake. Like, I am just not liked. John Jay ends up going, it becomes the Jay Treaty. But he was not a person, I think, who he ever expected that he would have that kind of popularity that he could be president. So the Reynolds pamphlet actually kind of, it's a scandal, but it doesn't destroy at that moment anything for him. Memorials and tributes and honors. So Hamilton and Jefferson, when you look at their status in American history, they kind of do this a lot, right? One of them is having a moment, the other one collapses, and vice versa. Hamilton had a big moment just after the Civil War because he was the Union guy. Then along came, and at the beginning of the 20th century, he's the guy who wants government to do all kinds of great things. He has another moment. Then you get the stock market crash, and he's like kicked into hell, right? People are like, we don't want this Mr. Wall Street guy as a hero anymore, and he's banished. He reappears a little bit during the 1950s, which is his centennial or bicentennial of his birth, and a little bit more during the Cold War, because he's the guy who's like nationalism in America versus. But the fact of the matter is, for a lot of the 20th century, he's not a major founder in the way that Jefferson is, and Washington is, and Madison is. Even John Adams is kind of does not have a lot of memorials to him, but Hamilton, in a sense, has less. It's evidence of what I started out by saying, which is I used to give a lot of lectures many years ago, and the opening of them was always, this person should be a founder. Like we should see him as a founder. I mean, it's kind of hard to imagine that now, but he just wasn't considered what I say to my students, a major leaguer. That there's major leaguers and minor leaguers. He was not put in the category of being a real founder, and so related to that, there are some statues to him, but not a lot of memorials. And then the last question is,
what part of the country that we now know owes to Hamilton's vision?
Well, so for better and worse, the thing that Hamilton did earliest, loudest, and continually was push for the national government to be stronger, to push for things to be centralized, to push for the nation to be more empowered, or the word he liked to use was energetic. Now, there are ways in which that can go astray. It's not always a positive thing, but I think that aspect of his vision, which was always sort of first and foremost, you can say that has survived. It changes over time, but I think that's there. I also think, he was at a time when a lot of people were very attached to and loyal to their states, still called their states their country. One of the benefits for Hamilton of being an outsider is that although he was a New Yorker, he didn't have that feeling. So he really had a kind of broad national view. So, now federalism, which now divides things and we're constantly balancing and juggling sovereignty, he was certainly comfortable with that in a way that people at the time weren't. I don't think that's part of his legacy, but I think it's a thing that he would understand and in some cases like, and in other cases not like, because it was ruining energy and it was preventing the government from being energetic. But I think the vision of this strong nation, holding its own on the world stage. You know, that's what he wanted. And in some ways, that's a very old-fashioned vision. It's like the British Empire. And in some ways, it was forward-looking. And I think, you know, who the heck knows what he would think about the United States today. But that aspect of it might give him comfort.
Well, as long as we're conjecturing, here's the last question. Kyle Engdahl from Cedar Falls, Iowa, is one of many people who asks what you think might have happened had Hamilton lived. Apart, I assume, from no musical. I'm just
yeah, it would have been a really boring musical. So here's the interesting answer to that. So I mentioned his last statement where he says, in those crises of public affairs that seem likely to happen, I felt the need not to decline the call. Actually, those are his exact words. He really did think that there was going to be this crisis in the government. It was going to collapse at some point. He also knew that the Federalists, his party, you know, democracy was rising and his party was falling. And so things were moving in a direction he didn't like. At one point, he says in a letter to a friend, this American world was not meant for me, right? It's going in a direction that I don't understand. All of that said, it's apparent that in his last year or two, he was thinking about doing another Federalist-style collection of essays on American government, and he had invited one person already to take part with him in writing this. So, you know, what would have happened? He would have been a aggressive, combative, grouchy political commentator. And, you know, he would have been weighing in. How much influence would he have had? I don't know. But his words would have continued and probably continued to get him attention and in trouble to the end of his days.
Thank you. That was really great. Thank you so much. You've been listening to Joanne Freeman discuss Alexander Hamilton, whose writings she's edited for the Library of America series, a volume that Lin-Manuel Miranda used for Hamilton's language in the musical. I hope you'll join us for forthcoming online events from Library of America. On Thursday, August 6th, the 75th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima and 50 years since the first Earth Day, renowned psychiatrist and author Robert J. Lifton and Katrina vanden Heuvel, publisher of The Nation, join us for Fate of the Earth, Jonathan Schell and His Legacy, a conversation about the writer and friend who put his remarkable literary gifts in the service of disarmament, nonviolence, international cooperation, and the irresistible power of democracy. Moderator is historian Martin J. Sherwin, editor of the New Library of America collection, Jonathan Schell, The Fate of the Earth, The Abolition, The Unconquerable World. Details about this and other upcoming LOA Live events can be found on our website, loa.org, where you'll also find information about Library of America's Hamilton and Schell editions and links to purchase those and other volumes of Great American Writing. You'll also find recordings of tonight's and previous LOA Live events. Thanks so much again to Joanne Freeman, and have a great evening.